environment. Being recorded, great. So we have too much stuff. So this is kind of one area of research that crosses both kind of historical analyses and contemporary work. In another kind of vein of my work, I'm really interested in the history of historic preservation. Now, this is kind of a niche subfield of scholarship in historic preservation, but there's a lot of writing about the 1930s, the mid-century period, and so on. But there's a really intense emphasis on kind of the East Coast, right? Cities like New York, places like Charleston, South Carolina, to some extent a little bit in Chicago, but there's not a lot of narratives about the history of historic preservation in these Midwestern cities. And I did grow up in Cincinnati. I have kind of this like soft spot affinity for Midwestern cities, and I think they're really underrepresented in scholarship and analysis of this kind of work. So I've done work looking at, things like historic preservation and urban renewal. I have some new projects going on to look at preservation in Cincinnati. And then I kind of started to come across little nuggets. This is how projects get started sometime, about preservation in Cleveland. This picture right here is John Simperman with Maxine Levin, our namesake over at the school. John Simperman was a councilman who was instrumental in forming the Cleveland Landmarks Commission and became its first director for many, many years. So I sort of stumbled on these things. Promotional material about demolition in the mid-century in Cleveland, which is just like a whole different can of worms. And fortuitously, I was searching for something else on the internet, and I stumbled across this man's name, John Simperman, started the Cleveland Landmarks Commission. I Googled John Simperman, and turns out his papers are at special collections at Cleveland State University Library. So I was like, I'm gonna go over and check this out. And like 6 years later, I have a book, right? So that's how it works. So where did this all get started? Aside from my interest in this project, when I started to dive into this, I knew like basic facts. The Cleveland Landmarks Commission formed in 1971. But obviously it doesn't just form in 1971, like out of the blue, right? So what are some of the precursors? And what I actually found was that the person really instrumental in building up this ethos in Cleveland is Robert Gady, commonly known as Bob Gady, who was an architect, a really avid advocate for historic preservation. And he began writing really in the 1950s about architects needing to take better stock of the situation of losing an unprecedented amount of historic buildings. In all cities, he was really involved in like the Cleveland AIA chapter had a committee on historic buildings. The National AIA had a committee on historic buildings in the 1950s. He was the chairman of that committee, of the National Committee for some period of time. So he was really involved kind of pervasively in becoming an advocate for historic preservation. At the same time, I found it really interesting that throughout this research, Cleveland really did innovative work in preservation in the 70s and 80s. At the same time, it's always like a little bit tempered, right? There's this sort of, I think of it like an inferiority complex that runs through, where it's like, we definitely are not like European cities. And like, we're not really even as good as like New York or Philadelphia. We have this kind of industrial working class built environment that even Bob Gady in 1964 said that he estimated about 50 buildings in Northeast Ohio, not just the city of Cleveland, were worthy of preservation protection. So even like the fiercest advocate kind of had this really tempered view from the start. And then to kind of further my research, I'd like to talk about how this project came about. Really fortunate that a big chunk of Bob Gady's papers are at special collections at Cleveland Public Library. So I spent months, like paper by paper. It's fascinating. And I included these partially because when I get to do presentations, I get to include a lot more images than I was allowed to include in the actual print book. So in his papers, I stumbled across these are his hand-drawn sketches that I've sort of cropped to put on the screen, but they are signed by him, R.C. Gady, February 1968, where he's talking about historic architecture showing value as a landmark, having contrast, texture, or drama in the cityscape. Historic architecture, it is a historic document. It's a tangible artifact of our past. There's quality and detail in the cityscape that sort of contrasts to the modern architecture that was being built at that time. So Bob Beatty starts pushing for preservation in the late 1960s. He this year in 1964, the actual first nugget of an idea to form a landmarks commission was written by Bob Beatty, a prospectus to establish a civic landmarks commission for the city of Cleveland. What's really interesting about this date, and this is my sort of surmising what happened, you kind of have to do this with the historical record sometimes. He was so involved with preservation nationally and around the state of Ohio that the thing that happened in 1964 is that the city of Cincinnati adopted what's called a local enabling ordinance. It was a local enabling ordinance for protection. It's literally called a protection ordinance. And it gave the city of Cincinnati the authority to create protection districts. They didn't use the word preservation, which were actually the first historic districts in the state of Ohio. They didn't create a citywide preservation commission. Cleveland's is actually the first in the state of Ohio. But in 1964, Cincinnati began to implement regulatory controls to try and protect key historic areas. And that's a different project that I'm just embarking on, by the way, to kind of dig into that situation. So he drafts this prospectus. He starts lobbying city council. He starts lobbying the planning commission, really not making a lot of headway. And then he kind of partners up with John Simperman, who was a councilman at the time on the west side, who became interested in preservation for a number of reasons. He had studied in Europe for a while. A highway was being built through his ward. And so he took up this cause and really spearheaded the formation of the Cleveland Landmarks Commission, which was officially established in June 1971. And it is, in fact, the first citywide landmarks governing commission in the state of Ohio. Also in 1971, we have these kind of catalytic things happening. This is just a quick overview, and then I'm going to get into some of the things that are sort of in more detail in the book. This building right here, not the one that's on fire. So that's just the photo that's available. The building next to it caught on fire. The building just to the side of it, Mechanics Block, which was threatened with demolition, and it captivated the interest of Maxine Goodman Levin, who became a fierce advocate for trying to save this building. She lost, and the building came down. But out of this, she continued to advocate, and in 1972 partnered with Tom Campbell and Olive Dini Tabor, who you see in the picture up there, to form the Cleveland Restoration Society, which obviously still exists here in Cleveland. In 1972, the Landmarks Commission designated the first landmarks in the city, the first one being City Hall, which was an effort to lead by example, right? If we're going to ask other people to do this, the first building we're going to designate is our own City Hall, right? That local government would take the lead. And I think really evidencing how innovative at the time and energetic, I think just like the energy that was around this by, I mean, I'm talking a really small group of people in the early 1970s. Brought the National Trust for Historic Preservation Conference to Cleveland in 1973. And this was really a way to like build momentum, build energy, like kind of stake their ground. What we are doing is important. There's a national movement behind it. And this then continued to progress. In 1975, our first historic district, which is Tesla Road, was designated. And also the first, I call it privately owned non-institutional building, was designated, which is, of course, is the Rotunda down on East 9th. And by non-institutional, I mean, prior to this, all the buildings that were designated were public buildings or quasi-public buildings or religious institutions. So this was kind of a big push forward. So this is kind of just lays the groundwork of like how things basically got started. But then in the book, what I actually do is dive into chapters about various kind of projects and initiatives that were taking place throughout the city, kind of organized thematically. Of course, it's a whole book, so I don't have time to go into all of these in depth, but I thought rather than picking one and ignoring the rest, I would kind of give this cursory overview of the things in the book and what really stood out to me from these various chapters. So the first kind of case study chapter, which is unique in the history of historic preservation really, is about efforts to preserve industrial heritage. And the idea of preserving industrial heritage in the 1970s was incredibly new and innovative. Like I cannot overstate how innovative this was. There is an entity called the Historic American Engineering Record, that was also relatively new. It was just created in the late 1960s, I think 1969, if I get that date right. So all of this is very new, and there had not been a lot of efforts to even think about industrial heritage as having historic or architectural or other types of social economic value at the time. So the Cleveland Landmarks Commission really early on, beginning in around 1974, so it had only been in existence for a very short period of time, preservationists began to think about the unique industrial assets that the region held. And lobbied. So one of the first National Register of Historic Places buildings, a building listed on the National Register of Historic Places, was the Division Avenue pumping station. And what's interesting is that, like, I think we often think about historic preservation of like the building, right? Like there's this building and we use it. But the documentation also covers the machinery, right? Like the things on the inside, because the building was like the shell. And then the key things were these innovative machines and industrial artifacts almost. And it turns out that those things are the hardest to save, right? Because you can repurpose a building maybe, but you can't repurpose this 3-story, I don't even know what this is, right? This like 3-story pumping machine that's inside the building. So in the about a year later in 1975, the Landmarks Commission partnered with Cleveland State University's Civil Engineering Department to do this inventory of engineering and industrial works in Cuyahoga County. And following that, beginning in, I think, 1976 or 1977, for multiple years, about 3 years, the Landmarks Commission partnered with the Historic American Engineering Record to create this inventory. You see the cover over here, inventory of engineering and industrial sites, focusing on lots of things, including the now laying in rust oil loaders, which are a huge aspect of this work, along with things like bridges and roads and buildings and all of the machinery that was inside, like the U.S. Steel plant, right? All of these kinds of things. One thing that's interesting that stood out to me about this work is that compared to other cities, like Lowell, Massachusetts was already thinking about adaptive reuse of industrial buildings. And none of this work really talked about adaptive reuse. So on one hand, I don't know how you adaptively reuse a Hewlett or unloader that's 10 stories tall and like too heavy to put on fill land even, right? But many of them were still in use. And this was actually a learning experience for me, right? In 1978, a lot of our industrial buildings were maybe used a little less or a little differently, but they weren't necessarily vacant already. And so the Landmarks Commission didn't see the need for reuse at the time. And it kind of created, I think, a void then when the vacancies escalated in the next couple of years, that there weren't plans or ideas in place because it was really focused on documentation. I also talk in the book about the warehouse district. I'm going to try and speed this up a little bit. So in the warehouse district to me was one of the most fascinating cases. And my original plan for this chapter was to focus on kind of like downtown and its peripheries, because there was also work done on Prospect Avenue. That was a pet project of Maxine Goodman Levin, and it just didn't end up fitting. This is the hardest part of writing a book, when you have to like cut these huge sections out of it. So I could talk about that more, but it's not in the book. The warehouse district was interesting to me because in the late 1970s, of course, we had a planning commission led by Norm Krumholtz, who's affiliated with my college, with my school, phenomenal, really focused on equity planning and social planning and the neighborhoods. And it kind of, I think, left a little bit of a void in physical planning in downtown Cleveland. And it was picked up by the Landmarks Commission, who wrote in 1977 this Cleveland's Historic Warehouse District plan. And it really is a physical development plan. It covers transportation and public space improvements and all kinds of things that were meant to enhance the idea that you could preserve this district, which was still experiencing demolition and increasing threats, like continued threats of demolition in the warehouse district. Planning for the warehouse district, happened in 1977 and has taken a long time, right? Like these things take a long time. It's one of the overall lessons of the book, that preservation is not a quick solution to urban revitalization or development. It's incremental, and especially in conditions of decline, like you have to be really patient, right? And appreciate like small wins as you get them. What's interesting here is that a lot of what happened in the warehouse district mimics what happened in other cities at this time, like New York's Soho neighborhood, where you had artists beginning to occupy or live in old industrial spaces. Here in Cleveland, there were artists living as live-work space in the warehouse buildings. And that was illegal. They were threatened with eviction from the city many times because they weren't zoned for residential use. So there had to be processes of changing the regulations to make it legal. So we had to change zoning. We also had to change, well, I say we, it's not me, right? The people who did this had to change the Ohio Basic Building Code, which basically, in the way it was written, prohibited adaptive reuse from being a functional thing. Like, if you had to have a door that was 3 feet wide and your historic building only had doorway entries that were 2 feet 11 inches, you had to rip them out. And then you have lots of other cost escalations and issues. And so preservationists here in Cleveland, working with other advocates for the warehouse district and around the state, lobbied and ultimately changed the Ohio Basic Building Code that really sets the foundation for all of the adaptive reuse that we see, not just in Cleveland, but really around the state of Ohio, and has become a model in many respects for other states about how to reduce regulatory barriers to using historic preservation. So I couldn't get through a book on the history of historic preservation in Cleveland without talking about neighborhoods a little bit, right? So there's sort of a set of 3 chapters that talk about preservation in neighborhoods. And I'll tell you from the outset, I didn't want to write a chapter about Ohio City. You might be like, oh, why would you not want to write? Same as like I didn't write a chapter about Playhouse Square, because it's kind of like, it's so well known, right? These aren't new stories to us. So I wanted to write a chapter about other neighborhoods. I wanted to write a chapter about Detroit Tollway and about Tremont. And I found stuff about Old Brooklyn. This stuff was fascinating. But it kind of didn't make sense without also having the context of what was happening in Ohio City. So I did end up writing about Ohio City, which is, of course, Cleveland's most quintessential preservation-based gentrification story. Although I will say that in my work and knowing other cities where you have these old neighborhoods that kind of were rediscovered in the 1970s, the gentrification of Ohio City was not nearly as rapid or as drastic, even today, even today, even if you look at it and kind of compare it to cities not facing these conditions of decline. So really the overall conditions of decline still kind of suppress the drasticness of a process like gentrification. But of course, we had housing renovations in Ohio City. We had West 25th Street and kind of the Market Square Historic District. And one of the interesting things I found about Ohio City, I had done other work on the city's current storefront renovation program, and which still exists, the storefront renovation and signage grant program, really came out of work of advocates on West 25th Street in Ohio City around 1982 that were looking for better public support. And so the city created this pilot program that they could test and then expanded it almost immediately to East 55th and Broadway and Slavic Village, and then a few years later to the citywide program. So to me, it's really interesting when you have these grassroots kind of initiatives that really are the foundation for these larger lasting programs in the city, citywide. When I began to look at other neighborhoods across the city, what I really found interesting was that in this era, the ideas about preservation weren't always coming from the top down. Like, yes, we had the Cleveland Landmarks Commission and we had the Cleveland Restoration Society, and they were doing tremendous amount of kind of entrepreneurial work and looking for grants and doing neighborhood studies and doing all of this stuff. But they weren't necessarily going around and saying like, okay, let's find people in Detroit Shoreway, let's organize them and let's get preservation going. It wasn't top down. In all of these neighborhoods, really, it was a grassroots effort. And you'll find someone like Ray Pianka in Detroit Shoreway, who was just like, nope, not going to let my neighborhood go, right? Not going to let these buildings go. We have something unique here, and we're gonna like be scrappy. It's the best way I can say it. And I think the stories, Ray Pianka has now passed away. He ultimately became he founded Detroit Shoreway with a group of people, the CDC, became a councilman, became a housing court judge. And there are these fantastic stories, like he used to park his car over the water meter, so they couldn't shut it off, the water to the building at that Gordon Square Arcade. Of course, it wasn't in good condition. This is the Gordon Square when its parapet fell to the street. Luckily, no one was injured. You have these kind of catalytic moments where this idea of like something is changing, right? As particularly on the West Side neighborhoods, like something is changing, population is changing. We can in our present day critique this a little bit. There is a racial dimension to this, of course. People were thinking like their neighborhood environment was changing, the small businesses were leaving, these new suburban malls were opening, like the whole feel of like what it meant to live in these neighborhoods was changing. And people started to look towards preservation as a way to save this and had to really be scrappy. I mean, I'm talking about putting piecemeal money together from here and there, partnering with whoever possible, finding whatever pocket of money was possible. At the time, there were federal programs that were funneled through the city, like the Urban Development Action Grant, which no longer exists, which really helped neighborhoods in many cases do both planning and physical development projects. But when you get out of a place like Detroit Shoreway, where like the grassroots narrative is really strong, you also find it in places like Old Brooklyn and Tremont. In Old Brooklyn, you had a neighborhood that wasn't quite experiencing the same level of population loss. It was pretty stable. In fact, it was still growing in the beginning of the 1970s. But you could like see what was happening in the rest of the city, and people became concerned about like what would happen with their business district along Pearl Road in Old Brooklyn. The building you see here is the Broadview Theater. It's gone. It's now, I think, a Dollar General there. Something is gone. Something is there, but it is not this building. They tried very hard to save this building, and they did not. And so that's one of the lessons. Like, I mean, they worked for, I think in total about 15 to 18 years through various sales and deals and negotiations and rental agreements and partnership agreements to try and find a way to save this one building in Old Brooklyn. And they ultimately didn't succeed. And that's kind of like a reality. I think I say somewhere in the end of this book that like at times I wrote this book and I was just like, it's heartbreaking, right? Because people tried so hard, right? And sometimes it just wasn't possible. And in Tremont, you had kind of another grassroots effort thinking about particularly housing and housing stock and housing quality, because much of the housing, you know, Tremont today is another one of our very gentrifying neighborhoods, but the housing in Tremont was really built, not entirely, but for the most part, it's kind of working class housing. So by the 1970s, 1980s, you have houses that like, they're not well insulated, they're not weatherized, they need kind of basic improvements just to make them livable dwelling units. And you have these grassroots efforts. And I think this story, the grassroots story, to really understand that it's not always top-down preservation. There were a lot of studies done. I could have put the covers of those studies here. The Landmarks Commission did a study in Old Brooklyn. They did a study for Tremont. They helped Ohio City get their historic districts created. So of course there's involvement, but it really came at the request and after the kind of initial organizing of residents in place who were concerned about the future of their neighborhoods. Then I move across town to Buckeye, and I have to tell you, this was probably the most challenging, but also like probably my favorite. Between this and the work on industrial heritage, the story of Buckeye, it illustrates so well what we know about cities in the 1970s, what we know about urban neighborhoods on the east side of Cleveland in the 1960s and 70s. Right? Buckeye underwent rapid racial change. Western Buckeye, kind of Buckeye Woodhill, if you will, really in the 60s, and the Eastern Edge, Buckeye Shaker in the 1970s. And Buckeye, unbeknownst to me, I learned a lot about Buckeye doing this research, was once the largest Hungarian enclave in the United States. And people, like, I just talk in really sort of blunt terms, people flipped out, right? By the 1970s, people were in a panic. There's an organization that formed really in the mid-60s, the Buckeye Neighborhood Nationalities Civic Association, that wanted to secede from the city of Cleveland and join Shaker Heights because they were so afraid of racial change happening in their neighborhood. They developed a plan, they called it a racial apportionment plan, that would require all suburban communities to accept a certain number of African-American residents so that they wouldn't all come to Buckeye. right? So there's a very strong racial dynamic of what's going on here. But you have this history and this built environment that's the legacy of the largely Hungarian population. And so you have, by the mid-70s, you have local community development corporations working with the Landmarks Commission to document. So this is the architectural character study, Buckeye Road. Interestingly enough, almost all of these studies were done in partnership with Kent State's College of Architecture and Environmental Design. There was a very strong partnership between the Landmarks Commission and this college at Kent State to undertake this work and to have students do these projects. So they did this survey work, they documented, there's these fantastic drawings. This is the drawing in the plan, or it's really a survey of St. Elizabeth. St. Elizabeth is still standing today on Buckeye Road. And ultimately nothing came of it. So there was a proposal in the late 1970s to create a Buckeye Road Conservation District that got squashed by the legal office of the city of Cleveland because the city didn't have authority to create conservation districts. It was meant to be a little bit different than a traditional historic district. It wouldn't be so rigid in its architectural controls, for instance. But the ordinance creating the Landmarks Commission didn't give them the authority to create that kind of district. So that got squashed. By the early 80s, the idea came back up. There's a proposal. This is a proposal right here. This would be the area for the Buckeye Road Historic District, which would have included Buckeye Road along the center. This is here, and large blocks of housing surrounding it. And this typical, this is the typical housing in Buckeye, the Cleveland Double. Nothing ever came of that either. And ultimately what you had in Buckeye, which I included, this is kind of an abbreviated version. I know it's I have this table in the book of all of the churches, were really religious institutions. There's one synagogue that were documented in this survey, right? There's a list of all the religious institutions included in this survey. And I dug to find out what happened to them. And so this is what happened to them. This is a sample of them, right? The first date is when they were established. So Shaker Square United Hungarian Baptist was established in 1948, and the building was built also in 1948. But many were old congregations. You can see buildings being built by the Hungarian community all the way up through 1954. And what are they today? So a couple are vacant. Most of them are neighborhood-based Black churches serving the Buckeye neighborhood. And when did this happen? So the synagogue sold in 1972, 76, 82, 89. You can almost trace the history of change by looking at the change in this one particular subset of institutions in the Buckeye neighborhood. Many of them closed, so this is sheer sort of shrinkage of numbers. Congregation closed, and many of them dispersed. Solon, Orange, Walton Hills, right? So the congregations picked up and moved. And there were all kinds of other things. I mean, the Hungarian community was organizing to try and petition the Hungarian government to help pay for elderly residents to move back to Hungary because they didn't want to stay in Buckeye. And so this story was really tough because it was very clear. And I try and walk a fine line on this one because it's the 1970s. It was very clear that preservationists had no ability to handle this situation, right? You're trying to preserve a neighborhood. It's all about the architecture and the history as a Hungarian community. And by the mid-80s, there are no Hungarians left, right? And so it raises these questions of preservation of what and for whom? And when you have that situation, how do you connect to the current residents that are there? And if we carry this story forward, I would say one of the lessons about Buckeye that really has stuck with me is that I don't want to say no one cares about Buckeye anymore. I think there's work going on there. From a preservation standpoint, though, Buckeye is now been a predominantly Black neighborhood for as long as it was a Hungarian neighborhood. And our values in preservation don't reflect or respect that. Does that make sense? And so I think I have no clear answers. I try not to be incredibly harsh and judgmental because it was the 1970s and preservationists in Cleveland actually were trying to do work in some of our historically Black neighborhoods with some historically Black institutions and buildings, but not at the same scale, So we've made a lot of progress in that sense, but I think there's still a lot to do. Finally, and I want to get to questions, so I'm going to wrap up very quickly. Finally, I dove into this and I actually got a really harsh, if you ever write a book or a journal article, you get these like, it is peer reviewed, right? You get some harsh reviews sometimes. And I got one review that was like, throw this chapter out. This is not related to preservation. It's a whole chapter on housing rehabilitation programs in the 1970s and 80s. And I was like, yes, it is. Shut up. These are not, so this is not the Landmarks Commission. This is not the Cleveland Restoration Society. This is largely the city's community development department and nonprofit housing organizations like Lutheran Housing Corporation, eventually the Cleveland Housing Network, Neighborhood Housing Services that were, the city had a 3% loan program, the cash program, which was a public-private partnership. They had all these programs to try and save the city's housing because it was in bad shape and a lot of poverty. People weren't qualifying for loans. So if you don't maintain a building, we know this in historic preservation. If you don't maintain a building, it will fall down. I don't care how old it is. I don't care what it was made of. Rule of life. You don't maintain it, it will fall down eventually. And you have to do some things to it. And so when you have a city high in poverty, people aren't even qualifying for private loans. So you can't, and we have redlining, we have insurance redlining. So redlining we think of as like preventing people from buying houses, right? That you won't get a mortgage loan. You also couldn't get home rehabilitation loans. Thanks, Limit Lend, for that. And so it's this kind of crisis situation. So there are these vast landscapes, urban homesteading programs. There were housing fairs. I found this stuff fascinating. I think in the end, it's kind of like a short term. Most of it was short term. There's, you know, like the urban homesteading program. I'm able to trace the first home that actually transferred. There was like a period of time you got a home for $1. You had to live in it for a period of time and do so much work on it. And you could use the city's loans to do that. The first home that transferred from the homesteading program, the deed was transferred to it was a lottery. People signed up, you buy a home for $1. The first deed transferred. And the building today is worth less than it was in 1981. So as a long-term solution, I think there are some questions about the city's home rehabilitation programs, confounded by tons of other things like market conditions and foreclosure crisis and ongoing decline. But I think this idea that preservation is somehow separate and distinct and shouldn't touch more widespread housing rehabilitation initiatives is ludicrous, right? I mean, this is the built environment. This is the fabric of the city, these swaths of the city. And, you know, whether they're like, you know, awesome, grand Queen Anne homes or these worker cottages, you know, that's not the point, right? The point is they have their own history and they create the fabric of our city. With that, I really just, I love this image and I didn't get to include it in the book, right? So I'm putting up here just in conclusion before we get to questions. This is a map done by the Cleveland Restoration Society and the Cleveland Landmarks Commission in May of 1977, showing all of the neighborhood revitalization going on in Cleveland. And I think for the most part, every single one of these areas is still being worked on, right? And to me, it's this legacy of how long it takes, how persistent and entrenched decline is, and how persistent and passionate preservationists have to be to get their work done, right? And how every part of this city has some level, you know, whether we think of it as historic or architectural or social or economic or cultural significance that makes things worthy of preservation. It should touch all parts of this city, right? And I think just to wrap up, you know, some of the key things, I have these kind of key takeaways at the end of the book, and many of them are kind of common sense. You need partnerships. You need to get creative with funding. One thing I would love preservationists to do more of today is to be like innovative and entrepreneurial. He was such a rich narrative of what happened in the 1970s, but like once you get going, then you have a commission, then you have things designated, then you have to review applications for changes. You get into like the managerial aspect of it. You don't have as much time to do the entrepreneurial things, especially if you don't have a lot of funding, which preservation never has a lot of funding. So I would love to see more entrepreneurial spirit. I think preservationists have come a long way in tackling issues of race, particularly here in Cleveland. The Cleveland Restoration Society is doing great work around this right now. Civil rights trail that's being developed, new markers going in. They've heard me say this, I say it, but it's always not enough, right? We always have to keep moving. I think something preservationists have not touched and still struggle with are issues of poverty. right? Both in terms of preserving places that were historically poor or working class, or preserving places that are today predominantly poor or in poverty. And those financial issues are really escalated compared to like asking, you know, my neighbors in Shaker Heights to keep their houses in good condition, right? That's a different ask than if you're in Glenville, right? Or name all the other neighborhoods, right? Particularly across the east side of Cleveland. So I think I'm going to stop there. I went a little too long, but I'm happy to take any questions or talk about any of this stuff. It's really fantastic. Greg.
So I have two questions. And they're based on two things you brought up that you think are really important, but generally around much. One is industrial architecture.
Yep.
There's been a lot of demolition. Even now, I'm not deciding to do downtown. We review projects because there's no smart districts of landmarks. They always want to stop everything. It's difficult to adapt the review.
Yes.
What can we do about that? Number two, another issue I feel is that some of our historic districts are just the commercial core, and even though the houses around them might not be like big, you know, upper class home, it's important historical context, and you're not giving that neighborhood any incentive to see itself as a historic district. So like Slavic Village is a perfect example, whereas in Ohio City, the residences are part of the historic district, so everybody's kind of involved in the effort. So how do we fix that?
All right, so I'll take the industrial one first. Here's my view on like when you're talking about like the machinery and the infrastructure, the bridges, right? All of these, the Hewletts, which are still around, like we just have to put them back together somehow, right? Somewhere. Is that I think if we shifted our perspective from thinking of them as like historic resources, like a building, we think about building, we think, how would we reuse it? Like if we think of them as sculpture, right? If we think of them as like an art artifact, it might change how we understand them and their importance in the landscape. And maybe they're not all continued to be used as bridges. Maybe they're locked in an upright position, or maybe the platform is gone, but the sides remain as a piece of public sculpture. Like those are the kinds of, I think, more creative ideas. I would love to see an Industrial Valley Historic District. I think it's probably not going to happen. I don't know if anyone's even talking about it. One of the reviewers for the book actually said, I read this and I had to just sit. Like the reviewers are probably people in preservation and planning history. So I don't know if it's a he or she, they had to just sit because they said, you know, as we always think of like in this era, Boston's like getting creative, preserving Faneuil Hall and these things. And like, there's Cleveland with its Hewletts, right? And it's like, it's no less important. It's just a different type of artifact. And I think we have to shift our mindset to that understanding and get a little bit creative. To the historic district question, I absolutely agree. I think that the kind of old-fashioned, outdated view that only certain types of houses from an architectural standpoint are worthy of preservation needs to go. I always have said for my whole career, I'm a non-traditional preservationist, right? In some neighborhoods, we got to relax, right? Like in Slavic Village, you're never going to get these pristine renovations. You're never going to get, like the income isn't there, the economic conditions aren't there. But maybe we could focus instead of on the architectural details, like even the windows, right, of a building, if we could step back and think about the fabric, right? And that what we want is the fabric to be in place, and the details might change. But if we don't do anything at all, you're going to have this like gap-toothed landscape that doesn't make any sense to anybody because it's not well organized anymore. It loses its context. So I think these things are really valuable. I think like, I mean, how to do it, like you got to get the city and the Landmarks Commission and preservation advocacy. And like, it's really, you know this, right? It's really tough to build that grassroots support. And I think breaking down the idea of what preservation is so that when you have residents in a place like Slavic Village, who may be, you know, on a lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, I think the inclination is to think like, that's not for here, right? Like that's for Ohio City or those fancy downtown buildings. Like, and so how do we shift that mindset? That's like a much larger endeavor. but one that I think would be really, you know, this city's built environment is unique, and it's interesting, and it's great, and highly underappreciated. And that, I think, is the key. Until you get people to appreciate it, you're going to have a hard time advocating to save it. Yeah.
So I want to really have a lot of synergies and people are underappreciated, but I also knew that it's needed for the construction. So what are your thoughts behind preserving the plans? Because I do agree that it's important to be preserving the ideas behind why the houses were created and what those houses were created, or what. So what are your thoughts on that, and what are like strategies and techniques that?
Sure. So yeah. Great. Okay, yes. So the question is about the kind of tensions, I think, between understanding the value of a wide range of housing and the city's vast landscape of housing, with the tensions with then some of the known poor construction quality of some of the houses. And I think by that, you like a lot of the houses, especially in working class parts of the city, went up fast and cheap because they went up in the era where the city was growing so rapidly that like you just had to build stuff as fast as possible. So I'll start by saying something like, this is one of my most memorable conversations with Ray Pianka from Detroit Shoreway before he passed away. It was actually just a few months before he unfortunately passed away at an event at Cleveland State. And I actually asked him this question. I said, what do you like? What about like all the wood frame houses? And he said, stop it. Stop with this nonsense that they're poorly constructed. They're more than 100 years old and they're still here. And I was like, okay. So to keep that in mind, right? Like, I get it. Like they lack some insulation, the windows, like, and I think it's like poor construction. And I think the decades of neglect and disinvestment and lack of maintenance. I think I really do believe in maintenance, strong maintenance plans that when you have, there was this a study. I did some research once on just going back to Slavic Village that something like 70 to 80% of the houses had been covered in vinyl siding, which by definition makes them ineligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. I think it's ludicrous, right? Because that change, like if we really think about preservation in that way, that change is a symbol of what that neighborhood has gone through, right? Socioeconomically. I actually offer this argument that no one wants to hear, that a neighborhood like Slavic Village has been in decline for 100 years, and that is significant from a historical perspective. No one wants to preserve the landscape of decline. Like that's a really interesting kind of theoretical thought exercise. Like what would that look like? So I think things like weatherization programs, basic maintenance, and not to dismiss the concern, but I mean, I think he's right? They're 120 years old, more in some cases, and they're still here. So to say that they're worthless feels difficult because they might have been built cheaply and poorly, and maybe we could find incremental ways of improving them through different kinds of like targeted city programs or grant programs. I think from a preservation standpoint, in some cases, preservation is faulty in that we offer traditional preservation offers a lot of rules and regulations without a lot of incentives and help, particularly for housing. And so I think that's something that would be worthwhile to address, but I don't have an easy answer. But I think it's worth like continuing to think about strategies for that situation. Here, and then we'll go back. Is that okay? Yes.
And the transparency and honesty with regard to some of the ethnic reasons behind Vanishing City. I grew up in St. Clair, and as a child, I was folks moving out of the community, elderly. Certain that, which is probably one of the reasons. So my question is, how can we take this message to areas such as Glenville and so forth to build that momentum from the grassroots?
Yeah, That's a really great question. I mean, you know, my go-to would always be like, you know, work with the CDCs. But in honesty, like the community development landscape in Cleveland has changed a lot in the past 15 years. So that is maybe not the best kind of entry point. I think that in any neighborhood, you will likely find some grassroots activists who are concerned about their neighborhood, or maybe even as small as their block, right? And if you can find ways to tap into that, right? And to begin to work with people. So I'm always hesitant. Like, I don't want to go into neighborhoods and say like, I'll come to your neighborhood meeting and tell you why you should do this. Like that's not going to go well, you know? And so I think, you know, if you can find the seeds of people who speak up, who are concerned about their street, who are concerned about housing conditions on their street, who are concerned about the lack of public investment, and tap into that to build coalitions of people who are interested. And I mean, you know, St. Clair Superior is one, which is really an increasing kind of gap tooth landscape. I call that, right, when buildings are missing. And some streets are really sad, but some of it is just gorgeous, right? Parts of Glenville, I mean, I moved here from Philadelphia, and I remember the first time I drove up in Glenville at the top of the Cultural Gardens, and I was like, man, this would be $1 million homes in many other cities, like with a park right there with it, like it's all there, right? Like the bones are there, the infrastructure is there. The housing quality varies, but you have these different, you know, potential price points. So, you know, and I'm not going to stand here and say that everybody cares or everyone cares about preservation. I think most people care about their street and about their neighborhood and about their block and about their housing conditions and about their quality of life, right? And if you can kind of tap into that and then make the connective thread that like preservation is one piece, right? Can be a piece of this answer where we can find ways to save and improve your neighborhood. I think you can start to build those. I think since I've been in Cleveland, this is my 14th year here. I think there's so many other challenges that it's really difficult. People are concerned about safety. People are concerned about having enough food to eat, right? And so, like this question, like, is preservation just like the frosting on the cake, or is it really fundamental? I'm kind of in the fundamental camp, right? Because these are the places we live. Like, this is our built environment. This is where we function every day. And if we just let it go to nothing, then we've harmed everyone's quality of life. I don't know if I totally got to it's a really hard thing, but I think building those coalitions and tapping into organizations or residents who already have this kind of innate sense of that situation would be a great place to start. Yeah.
Just quickly ask you a question from our audience.
Yes. Yes.
One of the questions we have from the remote audience is related to what you were just talking about. How do you see the reinvestment funding to take the demolition after?
How did the Reinvestment Act funding that paid for demolition impact the urban landscape of Cleveland? So here's the deal. I get it. Like, I'm not a don't demolish anything ever person. I think the biggest negative consequence is that I saw, just in my observations of what was happening, somewhat of a lack of coordination, right? And so demolition in and of itself isn't bad. I started out by saying we live in a city with too much stuff, right? I mean that. We live in a county with too much stuff. At this point, we likely live in a state with too much stuff, right? So things gotta go. And you have kind of a zero-sum game if you don't let anything go. Like, you rehab a school for housing and people move into it, that's great, but then you have houses that are vacant if no one's moving in, right? So you have this kind of moving around. The demolition that's happened, I think it's hard because it's targeted. Like, this house is in dire condition. It's about to fall down. It needs to go. This one over here, this one over here. And you end up then, if you scale way back with a city with like one here, one here, one here, one here, one here, you haven't probably cleared a whole block almost anywhere, which is like the best way to encourage redevelopment is to have larger tracts of land. So you have these small little things, one lot here, one lot there, side yard programs. Like, there are things that happen, but when it's not really a coordinated strategy, then it's difficult in the aftermath to come up with a coordinated strategy of what should happen next. right? Because you had a very piecemeal demolition. And that's not to say that people leading that charge were, you know, ill-informed or doing something wrong. I think it was like doing what they could. That was really like in the wake of the foreclosure crisis. I mean, that was a crisis moment. That was really like a crisis moment. And you had vandalism happening. You had like real on the ground concerns of safety and security. And, but I think I would have liked to see a more coordinated effort so that you had left, at least to a better extent, more intact blocks and more larger tracts prime for either redevelopment or like urban parkland, right? Like if you had a whole block cleared, then you maybe have a new neighborhood park. But when you have a block had 15 houses and now it has 8 and every third is vacant, it's like, it doesn't make sense. And so I think it impacts that kind of natural sensibility of the landscape where it no longer works. Great question. Yes, right here. Yes. Well, there's so many. I mean, so with my background, it didn't make it into the book. I mean, some of them are just stories that like became, you know, you kind of find these things and they become like near and dear to you, right? So I think the story of Prospect Avenue, particularly because Maxine Goodman Levin, like that was her project. She was so invested in it. And she's the namesake of my former college, now school. I never got to meet her. She passed away before I moved to Cleveland. But it was like this weird sort of like connection I felt reading this. And she was like an, you know, older, wealthy white woman philanthropist. Her husband had passed away. She just was doing preservation philanthropy, which has a long history with white wealthy women. But like really spunky. So Prospect Avenue in the 1970s was the city's red light district. And so there's these hilarious, I mean, it's just hilarious stories. Maxine went and knocked on the door and told that guy to get out of her building. And it was like, oh my God, I wish I would have met this. Like, I think I would have really liked her, you know? So that kind of story, it's hard to lose. One thing that kept coming up that I would like to write about just separately, I have to kind of think about it, was the really concerted, passionate effort around what to do with League Park in Huff. And so there were like plans and meetings, and I mean, meetings and meetings. Simperman went to another meeting. There was a League Park, Friends of League Park group, all the way back to like 1976. And of course, just a couple of years ago, it reopened. It's finally kind of rehabbed of what was left and reopened as a neighborhood park. And so like the idea that the notion that those ideas had seeds, you know, 40, almost 50 years ago at this point. I was born in the 70s, so I don't like to admit that it's almost 50 years ago, but it was, right? And so that the seeds were back then, and it's taken this long. I think it took my brain a long time to wrap around just how long it takes to do some of this stuff here. And the final thing I think was how familiar the names were. So, you know, Tom Yablonsky's name comes up in the, you know, warehouse district work in the 1970s. He was still running the warehouse district and Gateway Development Corporations as I was writing the book, right? John Simperman's still around. I initially recognized his name because when I started the research, what I learned was his nephew, Joe Simperman, was a councilman at the time. And I recognized the name and I thought there has to be a connection here, right? And so this is a Cleveland thing. And it's probably in other cities too, but the persistence of the people who are involved is sort of impressive, right? That many of the people are still around, or those names carried so long. So yeah, and there's lots of other stuff. Yeah, Steve.
Thanks so much for a great talk. It's fascinating. I can't wait to read the book. We've talked, mentioned a little bit the foreclosure crisis and the degree to which that just totally rearranged the conversation. And you talked about this really innovative work, like industrial stuff in the 70s. Did you go far enough in your research to see what happened in 1981, 82, 83, as there was a shock very similar?
Yeah. Yes. yes, I'll repeat the question. So the question is, you know, we've mentioned a few times in the Q&A, like the recent foreclosure crisis, like 2008, 2012, and what about the earlier waves of foreclosure crises, like the early 80s, and what happened between the work in the 1970s into the 1980s? So yes, the book actually is mostly centered on the 1970s. So there's the precursor stuff of the 50s and 60s, mostly centered on the 70s, but all of the stories in the book carry forward from the 1980s, somewhat to the present. So in the industrial chapter, I talk about like the long history of what happened to the Hewlett or unloaders, to their present status and storage, two of them. In terms of like the early 80s and the foreclosure crisis, it's interesting because it didn't come up that directly in that question. I think what happened in the early 80s that really kind of impacted was a massive wave of industrial closures and industrial exodus from the city. And so that's like all of this industrial work, the documentation had been in the late 1970s. I think the last historic American engineering recording project took place in the summer of 1979. And there was meant to be additional rounds and they never got funded, so it stopped. And most of this documentation can still be found, by the way, at the Library of Congress has the Hare and Historic American Building Survey records. So you can go look at these like wonderful photos of the US Steel plant and all the bridges and all these things. So the industrial stuff sort of just stops, right? And I think that my interpretation is likely kind of a crisis point of like, oh, we weren't expecting that, right? I mean, if city leaders, maybe they were expecting it and they never said, but like if experts in economic development weren't totally ready for what happened, preservationists were certainly not ready for what happened. That's a different skill set. And in terms of housing, you kind of see a shift. Really in the 70s, it's like the formation, because you had it's all tied to what's happening at the federal level and housing rehab. So you have the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974, and suddenly people are like, we can rehab things. We don't have to tear it all down. And you get the Urban Development Action Grants by the end of the 70s. And there's a lot of kind of fits and starts. I think the 80s and housing rehab is really dominated by the Voinovich administration, which shifted to much more like variable loan programs, trying much more to connect to the private sector, which makes sense in that political context. But you don't really see the housing rehab die off. It just sort of shifts, and you get new organizations like the Cleveland Housing Network formed to work on housing. So I think there are some shifts. I don't think in the historical record that I accessed or the way I looked at it, it didn't exactly parallel what happened. In fact, the demolition here really was much heavier in the 60s and 70s, in the early 70s. Like there's a note in the book, I'm going to forget the numbers, but it's something like in the first year of the Landmarks Commission, it was funded at like $40,000 by the city. And there was a program called Operation Demolition that was funded at like 15 million, right? And so we're way out of scale, right? Way out of scale. We're good? Yes.
So we don't think that.
Thank you for this robust conversation. We had a lot of questions online we weren't able to get to. Stephanie, I don't know if you're available to stick around for a few minutes, but a lot of our students need to get to class. So
I appreciate that. No.
Thank you so much. This was a really great time.
All right. Thank you, guys.